Those of you that may not be familiar with the term knowledge graph, this quote from Gartner should hopefully help a little bit. Knowledge graphs represent contextual, highly connected data that's organized in the form of graphs. They're used to contextualize search and turn data into knowledge. So if we break this down a little bit, there's a couple of terms that pop out in this quote from Gartner. The word context, the words highly connected data, graph, contextualized search, and this whole idea of turning data into knowledge. So in a nutshell, what knowledge graphs represent is a software solution that allows us to link our data, and when we talk about data, we're thinking structured data, semi-structured, and even unstructured data together in a graph format to be able to support this idea of context-driven decision-making or contextualized search. What you see here in this next slide is what's known as the Gartner hype cycle. And even though this may be the first time you've heard about knowledge graphs, they're actually really gaining popularity very rapidly out in the enterprise data landscape right now. And as you can see from the hype cycle here, the concept of knowledge graphs are really on the steep part of the curve right now, nearing what's known as the innovation or the top of the innovation trigger phase. And this is really where rapid adoption starts occurring with technologies. So the interesting concept is Gartner's starting to track this very closely, and it may seem, as I said, that this idea of knowledge graphs has sort of popped out of nowhere. But we've actually been engaging with knowledge graphs for many years in the consumer landscape. And in typical kind of early adopter fashion, Google introduced this concept of knowledge graphs into their search results way back in 2012, actually via an acquisition that they made. And this really was Google's drive towards going away from strings to things in their search results, adding a lot more context around the search. And so in this example that you can see here, I did a search for clinical trials. Down the left-hand side, I get the typical kind of unstructured search results from Google. On the right-hand side, I've got a thing, in this case, clinical trial, explaining what this thing actually is, and then relationships to other contextual things that people tend to search about when they're searching for something like clinical trials and so on. And so when we look at why some of these very large companies are choosing Stardog today, it's really to solve problems that span highly connected, heterogeneous data sets involving structured, semi-structured, and unstructured data, as I said earlier, but also with varying scale and various types. In other words, what that means is it's not just about the typical entity types that we think about, such as people, places, and things. It's all about diverse entity types. So in other words, uncommon things such as genes or proteins or applications or business processes or events or projects or studies, and the list goes on and on. So lots of entity types that we're busy bringing together in these graphs. And we see the need to be able to quickly link and trace concepts across different data sets, while at the same time being able to use and uncover hidden or indirect relationships to be able to answer very complex questions. So typically, these are the four sets of problems that customers are bringing to us. And we see these four needs play out in our pharma customers, where they need to be able to unlock information that typically is siloed across different departments, labs, geographies, data lakes, etc. And here we're typically seeing the introduction of new smart search applications that are essentially leveraging the power of the semantic knowledge graph to be able to link and contextualize their data sets, typically across dozens of different data silos, so that ultimately users can ask very complex questions that essentially are driving them towards being able to discover the cure to a disease essentially faster than their competitors. We also see these same needs play out at NASA, and I wanted to just add this in. NASA was actually Stardog's very first customer, and we're actually very proud to say that we're going to have a part to play in the Artemis mission that will get us back to the moon and eventually back to Mars, or not back to Mars in the first place. And at NASA, Stardog is essentially unifying a very complex web of information across dozens of different sources covering things such as the requirements for putting objects and people into space, all the associated designs around these requirements, the hazards associated with space flight, people involved, all their skills, etc. And at NASA, Stardog is allowing the users of the solution to be able to answer questions 8 to 10 times faster than before. And as you can imagine, when someone's life may be hanging in the balance, being able to answer questions quickly is extremely important. So how is it that a single piece of software can have such diverse applications? And obviously, while it may be a single piece of software, there's actually 3 very important components that make Stardog special. And it's the combination of these 3 that allow our customers to think a little differently about solving some of their really complex problems. So what I want to do now is drill into these 3 special areas of Stardog. And it starts with the concept of being able to use the semantic graph as the foundation to be able to manage any type of data. And again, you'll see this quote here from Gartner, where you can see that they're expecting the application of graph processing and graph databases to grow at 100% annually through 2022. So quite a statement from Gartner. And the question is, why is Gartner so bullish about this? This is primarily because graph is the most flexible enterprise abstraction layer for data on the planet today that helps us solve really tough problems. And so the question is, why is that? Well, that's because in the world of semantic graphs, relationships now become what we think of as first-class citizens, as important as the entities themselves that we care about. This is also where we can start infusing meaning into our data, as opposed to kind of the structure-first approach that we typically leverage when we're using relational architectures in general. It's also where it allows us to now think about linking and tracing concepts and being able to, because of that, pivot our view very easily from one viewpoint to another without worrying about how to actually traverse across different types of data, different entities, and so on. And ultimately, the last piece of this is this foundational component gives us the flexibility to easily absorb change, because the entire approach to the data model in this world is driven off metadata. The second part is about using AI and inferencing to be able to generate more connections to further enhance the network effect within our data. And per Metcalfe's law, the more connections we can generate between the nodes in a network, the more valuable the network becomes. And this is done via a combination of declarative rules and also machine learning capabilities, where these inferred connections will start appearing as we ask and answer questions within the graph. This means that should the conditions change between questions, I actually could get completely different inferred results coming back to the end users. And given that stakeholders often have very different needs out of the same data, the capabilities exist to have multiple schemas on top of a single data set. So different folks can be asking and answering different questions on the same data. An example of inferencing at the bottom that you can see adding a little bit of context into a data set as purely an example could be healthcare professional only becomes an investigator when certain conditions are met in the data. For example, that person is affiliated with a site is busy conducting a study, a site has subjects enrolled in a study. Only then does a healthcare professional become an investigator. And an investigator is also a person, which is also a party, and so on. So many complex inferences can be generated out of the data, essentially to enhance the network effect. And the third part is all about virtualization, and this idea of not having to create copies of copies of copies every time we want to solve a particular business problem. So in the world of Stardog, all we need is a read-only connection to a back-end database, whether that be a structured database such as SQL, Oracle, or a semi-structured environment such as Cassandra, Mongo, Elasticsearch, and so on. We need a read-only connection, and at which point we can connect to those environments. And as questions are asked of the Stardog graph, we're converting that structured or semi-structured information into the semantic graph format and presenting it up to the applications and processes that are asking for it. This kind of approach, as you can well imagine, allows you to iterate very rapidly with regards to adding new sources and onboarding new data sets into the environment. And this guarantees that we're always getting the most up-to-date information when we ask questions. And in certain highly regulated environments, it's extremely important that we're getting the latest and greatest information every time we ask a question. In the NASA example, as you can well imagine, when someone's life is hanging in the balance, it might be really important that when we ask a question, we're getting the most up-to-date piece of information from the various back-end systems and so on. In cases, though, where we want to be able to increase performance even more, we're able to cache various, what we call virtual graphs, to be able to increase performance as well. So you can marry up the best of both worlds in terms of not having to move data and still being able to access that information really quickly. So to summarize, what makes Stardog special is, if you remember only one thing about my piece of this presentation, is Stardog is way more than just a graph database. What we do is combine the concept of semantic graph, which is about meaning, inferring meaning into your data, with AI and inferencing to be able to enhance the network effect within your data, and virtualization, whereby you don't have to physically load a single record into this environment to make it work. At this point, I'm going to hand off the presentation to Tim Williams from PHUSE, and we'll come back for Q&A at the end.
Great, thank you very much, Guy. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. And I'm sure someone will tell me if it's not displayed at the moment. And I'd like to also thank all of you for attending today's webinar. I know these are challenging times for everyone, and I appreciate you taking the time out of your day for this presentation. So as mentioned in the introduction, my name is Tim, and I volunteer with the PHUSE organization as a Knowledge Graph project lead. In my day job, I am a statistical solutions lead at UCB Biosciences. I've spent considerable time in the pharmaceutical industry, mostly in late phase clinical analysis and systems. I've seen a lot and committed many of the sins I will talk about today. While my presentation will focus on the pharmaceutical industry and late phase clinical trials specifically, those of you in other industries will recognize common challenges and I hope similar solutions. And lastly, the opinions I express today are my own, not those of PHUSE, Stardog, or my employer. So with that caveat out of the way, why am I talking about transformation? The pharmaceutical industry is well established. We have standards in place, guidelines, dictionaries, terminologies. Well, looking at it from the time perspective, it takes around 10 years from molecule discovery to marketplace. Now, the exactness of the numbers I will show today are debatable, but the general conclusions remain the same. Clinical trials consume 6 to 7 of those 10 years, though that may be improving. The cost of a successful drug, including all the failures that led up to it, ranges from 314 million to 2.8 billion. That is a lot, and costs keep going up. And with a success rate of less than 12%, these numbers are not great. So looking at this solely from a cost perspective, what if we could improve by a mere 1%? That sounds achievable. That small improvement would provide cost savings of between 3 and 28 million. And those savings could be reinvested in research and development to generate more insights, discover new molecules, generate new revenue streams. Investment in new technology would provide a positive feedback loop for additional transformation. And most importantly, patient value initiatives could be expanded. Let's keep this very achievable 1% in mind while I cover the other aspects of the industry. Today, I will start off by reviewing the current state of the pharmaceutical industry, laying the groundwork for why we need change. I will then talk about a possible future state, show work from our PHUSE project, provide industry examples of knowledge graph adoption. Yes, it is happening. And lastly, speak about implementation strategies that provide a path from the current to the future state. I hope to leave around 10 minutes at the end for Q&A and discussion. I will keep today's talk at a general level, but there are a few terms to define because some often have more than one definition. I define a knowledge graph as containing entities and relationships between those entities in a defined schema. It is machine readable with semantics that can be understood by both person and machine. An important aspect of the knowledge graph is that it is extensible. You can start with a small knowledge graph and build it out incrementally. The knowledge graphs I am talking about today are built using linked data as Resource Description Framework, or RDF. It is a very simple data model that uses the concept of a triple, which is comprised of a subject joined to an object by a semantic predicate. You may also be familiar with the semantic web that has been around for almost 20 years and is based on open standards like linked data's RDF, web ontology language, or OWL, the query language Sparkle, the validation and modeling language Shackle, a bit more on that later, and other components in the technology stack. From those few definitions, you may be thinking that knowledge graphs are a complex technology. Of course, when deploying any technology for the first time, there's a learning curve. This quote attributed to Dan Brickley and Libby Miller sums it up perfectly for me. The subject-predicate-object model is painfully simplistic. It is also extremely flexible and powerful, allowing us to build models that represent the real world. It is the real world that is complex. Clinical trials are complex. Knowledge graphs allow us to represent the drug development process and resulting data very accurately with unparalleled flexibility. In the introduction, I talked about time, cost, and success rate for why transformation is necessary. Now I will take a closer look at some of the underlying challenges facing the pharmaceutical industry. First, the data landscape. Pharma has a lot of legacy data that needs to be integrated. It ranges from large relational database systems down to individual files like SAS datasets delivered from contractors or spreadsheets that contain data and metadata. The data structures are inflexible and designed around the specific use cases of data collection and analysis. The infamous case report form influences electronic data capture systems and other databases, with a view toward performing analysis of study results, creating the clinical study report, and submitting the data to regulatory authorities. Gartner estimates that 80% of enterprise data is unstructured. This includes data sources like word processing files and PDF documents, think study design, study protocol, study report, and also images, audio, and video. Our data is increasingly complex. We want to capture data around the data, how it was collected, interrelationships between data values, context, metadata. Our data is increasingly diverse. We want to combine data from genomics, healthcare, prescription, clinical trial results, social media, wearables, ingestibles, and other real-world evidence data. The content and structure of this data varies widely. Because we cannot easily bring this data together, we are unable to unleash its full potential. The code landscape is often overlooked. For biostatistical analysis, the code is traditionally written in SAS, now increasingly in R, Python, and other languages and applications. What does the code do? A very large amount of the code does nothing more than basic data manipulation, merging, subsetting, categorization, and value coding as a setup for statistical analysis. Statistical procedures are the true value add at this stage. We also have a lot of code that performs output formatting for listings, tables, and plot displays. So what's the problem with this code? For one thing, there's a lot of it. Code is often copied over from one analysis to another with a lot of redundancy. Portions are commented out, and documentation may be poor or missing altogether. There are usually thousands of lines of code per analysis, with a likely error rate between 15 and 50 per 1,000 lines of code. This can have a substantial effect on the accuracy and quality of our results. We also lock ourselves into a specific application or programming language. Some SAS programmers do not want to learn R or Python. There's a lot of logic and metadata hard-coded into these programs. Code comments are used to document important decisions about program logic that affect the data and analysis. This may be the only place where these decisions are documented. Code is also used for adding context and complexity to the data that was either not captured at the time of collection or is relevant to the analysis and submission process. Moving on from programming code to a different type of coding, our industry relies on a number of dictionaries, taxonomies, and terminology coding standards that we must integrate with our results. Only a very few are available as linked data. And of course, do not forget company-specific sources of information that can vary in content and quality across those projects. You may have noticed the Medical Dictionary for Regulatory Activities, or MEDRA, on the previous slide, often used for coding of adverse events or medical history. This licensed dictionary is supplied as 5 terminology tables that range from lowest level term all the way up to system organ class. 3 key tables facilitate joining the terminology into the appropriate hierarchy, so we are definitely in relational territory here. The merging of these files is not difficult, but each company that receives the latest version of the files has to merge them together. Why are we continuing to work with data in this way? In one of our PHUSE projects, we require MEDRA codes for adverse events. Instead of merging using the relational approach, we converted the terminology to link data as RDF using R. This is a screen capture of an R Shiny app that I wrote. The app provides an interactive collapsible tree that shows the relationship of a lower level term, in this case application site itching, all the way up to its system organ class terms. The conversion scripts and R Shiny app are available on our GitHub site, minus the terminology files, which are licensed. The visualization based on the underlying data is a natural structure for using and browsing the terminology. The visualization directly shows how the data is stored as RDF. Application site itching has preferred term application site pruritus is the subject predicate object model of RDF. The query behind this visualization could not be simpler. It uses a Stardog paths query to start at a specified lowest level term, then traverse the path from that node all the way up to system organ class. It is so much easier and intuitive compared to the use of foreign key tables in relational structures, as we saw on the previous slide. In addition to dictionaries, terminologies, and so on, we should also discuss standards and data models. The pharmaceutical industry straddles both healthcare and research, so it must follow standards from both. These are just a few of the standards and do not include the various regulatory requirements. Most of these standards still use a relational row-by-column representation, like we saw for MEDRA. Some, like HL7 FHIR, have promising linked data initiatives. On the research side, we are indebted to the Clinical Data Interchange Standards Consortium, or CDISC, for standards development and deployment. I encourage you to check out their website for a nice interactive page that shows the multiple standards across the entire drug development lifecycle. It's really nicely done. CDISC has recently started using a graph-based approach for managing standards. Unfortunately, it is only available through an API, so users cannot benefit fully from the graph model. I hope that this will change in the future and that CDISC will strive to embrace fair data principles, which I will talk about briefly in a moment. The Study Data Tabulation Model, or SDTM, serves as another good example of the current state. Look closely at its definition for data tabulations and submission to regulatory authorities. The structure was built to satisfy specific use cases, and this makes it less flexible and less future-proof. Analysis programmers encounter SDTM data as separate files for each domain. This means that the demographics domain file must be joined to the treatment domain file, to the adverse events file, and more to perform an analysis. These are domain silos, with files that do not reflect the clinical trial process through which the data was collected. So a lot of context and meaning is not available. Also, companies spend millions of dollars converting tabular data to the latest tabular standard when a new version of a standard is released. It is very difficult to achieve a complete view of the patient when data is in disconnected silos, be it in individual SDTM files or large relational database systems. Data is traditionally siloed across multiple systems within a company. A system that manages site enrollment is separate from the system used for study design, yet another system is used for electronic data capture, and so forth. When companies need to bring data together to solve a specific problem, they often create what I call a purpose-built super silo, yet another relational system. Then, because this new system is a convenient data source, a scaffolding of applications start to be built around it, some official, some as shadow projects, with use cases for which this database was not originally designed. These new dependencies further harden the use of this inflexible silo. Your integration costs have gone up, because now you have more systems and more processes to maintain, yet the old systems are still in place. The data lake approach is receiving a lot of attention in pharma these days. Data lakes solve a single problem, co-location. You must design ETL processes to fill your lake, and it is then up to our modern day wizards, the data scientists, to prescribe meaning to the data. It is no wonder that data scientists spend 75% of their time cleaning and trying to understand the data. This is not time well spent. When the data is a knowledge graph, it is connected and within easy reach, not just co-located, but connected with semantic meaning. Often overlooked are the countless micro or shadow silos in your organization. These are usually spreadsheets scattered around the company that contain a large variety of very different types of information. These are especially troubling when you consider the error rate in spreadsheets. We need to bring this information out of the shadows and into the enterprise. I have one last topic to mention before I move on to future state. Our biggest challenge is not the technology. There are many complex factors at play. As an industry, we are risk averse when time, money, and patient safety are involved. We have established, validated processes that can be costly to change. Our teams would need to learn and hire new skill sets. Our business models support the status quo. We have a comfort level with familiar legacy vendors. They are not going to tell us to change when we keep giving them money. Recoding data to revise standards has become a cottage industry unto itself, and it is a big cottage. This is a significant revenue stream for contract organizations. But there is a way forward. Next, let's look at what the future could be. The transformation will be data-centric. Our use cases are many, spanning the entire drug development process. Data is at the foundation of all of these use cases. Our analytics are increasingly complex. We have evolved from the simple p-values, t-tests, and regressions of yesteryear to more complex analyses supporting machine learning, natural language processing, and artificial intelligence. Our data is the foundation of advanced analytics. Programming languages come and go. We're increasingly moving from SAS to R to Python and whatever comes next. Data is our constant. Standards continue to evolve. These standards are applied to our data. Data is the fundamental element upon which we should base our transformation. When data is the foundation for change, we must move away from our historically application-centric focus to one that is data-centric. As mentioned, data models have historically been created with planned use in mind, the analytics to be performed, the submission and regulatory requirements, where use case dictates structure. This must change to data that is modeled on real-world processes and meaning in order to provide a future-proof solution. Who are the designers in this future? In the past, we relied on IT architects and database administrators. When we start modeling processes and inserting meaningful semantics into the data, this team must expand to include the researchers, clinicians, analysts, all who work in close collaboration with IT and technology experts. We need to fundamentally change how we think about data. When I say data, you most likely picture in your mind a row by column structure. It is familiar, neat, orderly, easy to understand. We need to change this thinking to one where we envision data as values connected by meaningful relationships in multiple dimensions. Recall the study data tabulation model from my current state example. In the graph future, there's no need for merging, no need for foreign key tables like you saw in the metadata. Graph data is already integrated. You then begin to see data integration for what it is, a waste of time and resources. Remapping data from one version of a standard to the next can be largely automated. When data is stored in the graph using a standards neutral representation, it can be materialized into specific standards as needed with little manual intervention. From there, you can always map back to the old row by column format as needed to support legacy processes. I've talked a lot about knowledge graphs and modeling real-world processes in a use case neutral way. What does that mean? Well, as an example, you could create a model where a study has a treatment arm. A subject is assigned to that treatment arm. The model is extended to represent the entire study process with all of its various components, events, and rules. We can then map the instance data, an actual study, a specific treatment arm, a human study subject named Tim, to that model. This is the familiar subject-predicate-object model of RDF. Data-centric is patient-centric. In the knowledge graph approach, patient data is already integrated. When you query the data, you are selecting out what you want, pruning away what is not relevant to your current use case or analysis. Queries define the subset of data you are interested in. In this data-centric, patient-centric model, a comprehensive view of the patient can be achieved. The graph is extensible, so if the researcher or even the patient wanted more information about a study drug, they could seamlessly extend their query to sources like Wikidata or DBpedia. When linked data is used, terms for medical history and adverse events are not just easily integrated, you can trace terms from the lowest level term all the way up to system organ class, as I showed previously. The patient could even navigate from information about their medical condition to patient support forums. Social media platforms like Facebook use their own specialized form of graph database. Naturally, data integration raises privacy concerns. The knowledge graph approach provides both unique challenges and solutions in this space because the types of data can be explicitly categorized on a very granular level to allow or prevent access. And new initiatives like the SOLID platform, spearheaded by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, hold much promise for controlling your personal data. As a last topic in future state, I want to mention the concept of data mesh or data fabric, which is gaining traction. This is a way to bring together information from data silos, including data lakes, using a semantic layer. This layer can be a virtual graph that pulls data together at the time it is needed. For example, a specific analysis or a regulatory submission. This is attractive because it is unlikely that companies will replace their large relational systems in the short term. Plus, the flexibility of graph data means use cases do not have to be defined in advance. Ideally, the semantic graph model is built using open, community, and industry standards. I expect we will be hearing a lot more about data fabric in the near future. Now I will switch over to discuss some of the knowledge graph work I've been involved in at PHUSE. PHUSE provides an opportunity for pharma, biotech, and regulatory agencies to come together in a cooperative, pre-competitive environment. Working groups focus on areas like education, data transparency, and emerging technologies, to name but a few. There are individual projects within the working groups, and I invite you to visit the website to discover the interesting work that is happening there. The PHUSE organization has almost 9,000 members globally and hosts annual conference in both Europe and the US. There are also single-day events around the world that focus on a topic of interest, and a symposium where volunteers come together to work on standards, methodologies, technologies, and more. At the recent symposiums and European conferences, we held an interactive workshop for people to learn linked data. I created an interactive whiteboard application with my colleague Johannes Jolander from S-Cubed. This allowed our students to draw their own clinical trial that included patients, treatments, demographics. They exported their whiteboards as linked data, then queried over the graph of data, supplementing it from information, with information from DBpedia and other resources. Then they used a simple query to seamlessly merge the data from all of the students into a single graph to show how easy it is to integrate multiple studies. Stardog supplied the virtual servers, and we used Stardog Studio as the query environment. It has been a lot of fun. PHUSE has a long history with linked data, starting with one of the first projects, CDISC Foundational Standards in RDF, available to CDISC members on their website. Most of the other projects have been experiments with varying levels of success and implementation. The blue ones are the projects I have co-led, and the last one I will discuss today. Our current project is Study Data Validation and Submission Conformance. Why did we start this project? We see a great opportunity for improvement and collaboration. A recent retrospective study at the FDA looked across various types of submissions from 2016 to 2018. They found that 32% of submissions had data conformance issues. That does not mean that the submission was rejected, just that there were issues identified in the data. Why is this number so high? The reports from the FDA are more factual in nature, so I will offer my own personal opinion. A submission contains multiple studies. These are difficult to integrate for a variety of reasons. There can be confusion about the requirements and standards. This is improving. The FDA recently published a worksheet to help companies understand the requirements, and conformance appears to be increasing. But I think there are much deeper issues at play, and I am talking about them today. The legacy row-by-column relational data structures are causing us a lot of grief. There is a lack of consistent and unique identifiers for everything from drug products to identifying patients and events across studies. And we lack integration of both metadata and validation rules. With that background, we initiated a project with collaborators from PHUSE, the FDA, and academia. Because of current world events, we have yet to confirm our academic partner. Stardog is providing our knowledge graph, and we need volunteers. I am looking for a project co-lead, preferably someone with clinical or study knowledge, as well as ontology experience to help us build our models. We're also looking for anyone with an interest in what I'm about to cover in the next slides, so come learn with us. In the study data validation component of our project, we are modeling the FDA validation rules for preclinical data using Shapes Constraint Language, or SHACL. I will not go into the details of SHACL today, but think of SHACL as a way to define a conformance shape for something like a study subject. The shape defines that a study subject must have a gender, an age, a study treatment value. The conformance shape is applied to the data. Data that does not fit the shape is identified in a validation report. The submission conformance part of the project is focused more on the submission process, with the goal of increasing automation and completeness. It will also leverage the data validation component. This is where we will engage with existing expertise in academia. We follow FAIR principles for our project work, with all development freely available at our GitHub repository. We publish the project documentation from our GitHub repository using GitHub Pages. That's the URL near the top of this page. We hope the site will become a resource for learning how to apply SHACL to clinical and preclinical data. We are building the site now, so I won't show you the details other than a quick visualization. I want you to think about the current state, where rules are applied to the data and a report is generated. The report is usually separate from your data. So I'm just going to go over to the website here really quickly and show how everything is connected together. In blue, we have the actual instance data. So this is an animal subject that has a unique subject identifier. But there's actually two of them. So this is an error, which is why it's shown in red. The validation rules, or SHACL, are here in green. And this rule states that there should be a minimum of one and maximum of one unique subject identifier per animal subject, which it is attached to. When you run this shape against the data, it generates a report. And this is an excerpt from the report here showing that there is a violation, and it has a message that it violated a particular FDA rule, and it identifies what subject identified that, tripped that rule and the actual violation. So I won't go into any more detail, just other than to say everything is very well connected. I will now cover a few examples of where knowledge graphs are actually in use. There are many examples in other industries and a growing presence in life sciences and pharma. A subgraph of the linked open data cloud, the life sciences linked open data cloud, continues to grow. I found this resource challenging to use for late phase pharma, with some resources going dark over time. I believe it is most useful for drug discovery and early phase work. Wikidata continues to grow both in size and importance. DBpedia is a good source of information. BioPortal is an excellent resource for biomedical ontologies. There are too many resources to list today, so apologies if your favorite is not listed here. I've mentioned FAIR data a couple of times already. FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. The movement is gaining in popularity. The Pistoia Alliance has a FAIR implementation toolkit, and I should also mention their ontologies mapping project. AstraZeneca is leveraging FAIR knowledge graphs as one example. Initiatives at Bayer include adopting a data-centric approach to enable data reuse across 3 life sciences divisions, developing a FAIR data lake for legacy data, improving clinical trial design with linked data, and developing a permanent ID service, which is very important, and much more. Roche was an early adopter of knowledge graphs and continues to be an industry leader. They have developed common models for integration, a global data standards repository that is aligned with CDISC standards and follows FAIR principles. They have a semantically linked terminology service and are experimenting with linked data for clinical trial results, real-world data, and more. Now, perhaps your company is just starting or thinking about starting their knowledge graph journey. It can be a difficult road with many obstacles and plenty of opposition. I will now talk about implementation strategies to help overcome these obstacles to transformation. You may have heard of Google's Moonshot Manifesto, where you shoot for the moon to invent and apply state-of-the-art technology. This approach can be impractical for pharma, and I was influenced by the modified Roofshot Moonshot Manifesto, which encourages incremental impacts in production use, building toward the moonshot. I listed some examples here, but I find this analogy insufficient still. I now prefer the Stairway to the Stars Manifesto. It is still not a perfect analogy because many of these initiatives can and are occurring simultaneously, and the order can vary. Some projects are clearly more basic than others, like demonstrations and prototypes, compared to collaborative industry standards and shared industry knowledge graphs, which depend on the more basic fundamental initiatives. The analogy is better, but yes, not perfect. When talking about strategy, it is important to pause and think about the language we use. As technical people, we often have difficulty with messaging, a critical aspect of any project, especially when it involves many different departments and roles. I'll show 2 slides about messaging, or semantics of a different sort, if you will. The first term is data owner. Unless you are talking about data privacy, very important of course, this term implies and maintains the concept of data silos, which we are trying to break down. I prefer the term data steward. Who are the stewards? They are experts responsible for the data. They craft the data models and implement the approach, and they facilitate sharing and reuse. Next, on the topic of messaging, proof of concept. You may be tempted to tell your manager that you want to create a knowledge graph proof of concept. This implies that the technology is unproven, but it is proven. Linked data has been around for almost 20 years now. As my former prime minister would say, we have a good proof because it is proven. Yes, I voted for that guy, and that is the only political statement I wish to make today. What you need to do is provide an experiment or demonstrate a business case to the correctly targeted audience. Part of selling the data-centric knowledge graph transformation is knowing how to attach it to the right projects at your company. Pharma's relational database workhorses are not going anywhere. The new landscape will augment these older systems with graph technology. When lobbying for support and budget, we need to associate graph technology with the hot new initiatives. Knowledge graphs and semantic technologies can provide foundational support for a host of new technologies that are the current shiny new thing in IT budgets. Pitch your knowledge graph proposal to existing projects to ensure visibility, funding, and approvals. You must obtain support from very senior management. The majority will oppose change. Stay away from terms like semantic web, linked data, shackle. The project title should align with current interest at your company and use the company's dialect. Who will lead this transformation? There are many vested interests in maintaining the status quo. You will find allies and progressive thinkers within research and analytics. Find those people. Educate new people. When that knowledge graph light bulb moment happens for someone, they will never see data the same way again. To wrap up, some key points about what knowledge graphs bring to the table, not just for pharma. Fewer and simpler data models that represent real-world context. Less data manipulation, less programming code, less manual data conversion. Data integration, metadata, and validation can be built in. The model is flexible and incremental. You can build your solution over time. Land and expand your knowledge graph project. And don't forget the benefits of the follow your nose approach to information discovery. The impact of these changes is profound. It represents a paradigm shift in how we think about data. The results are higher quality data and successful submissions for new medicines at lower cost, gaining new insights through inference and supportive technologies like AI and machine learning, but overall, faster delivery of affordable, safe therapies for patients in need. In closing, a few acknowledgements are in order. First to Dave McComb for his thought-provoking books, Software Wasteland and the Data-Centric Revolution. You will recognize many of his themes in my talk today. Thanks to Dr. Krupp from Bayer and Dr. Fernandez from Roche for providing information about the initiatives at their companies. Thanks to all the good folks at PHUSE for their support and the good work that they do, to UCB for supporting my volunteering with PHUSE, and lastly to Stardog for their partnership with PHUSE in helping to organize today's webinar. And lastly, thank you to you for your kind attention.